David. The Labour History Society acknowledges the Darwin people of the Adelaide region, the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. We respect their spiritual relationship with their country and recognise their cultural heritage and beliefs are of continuing importance to Darwin people who live today. We pay our respects to elders past, present and future, and extend our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are present.
For those that don't know, my name is Doug Melbourne. I'm president of the Labour History Society. Derek?
Yeah, Derek Burke, member of IFAN, that's the Independent Peace for Australia Network, and Spirit Director as well.
We have a panel of speakers, and it's a great privilege to introduce the first speaker, Lynn Arnold, as I'm sure you're all familiar with. Following 2 years of active involvement in student politics at Adelaide Uni, Lynn succeeded Greg Stevens as chair of the VMC SA in March 1970. He oversaw the first two Moratorium marches, May the 9th and September the 18th. Leaving the VMC in late 1970, he succeeded to chair the campaign for peace in Vietnam. In July 1970, Lynn was a member of the Australian contingent on a mission to South Vietnam organised by the International Fellowship of Reconciliation. Lynn became a teacher in 1971 and later in 1979 a member of State Parliament. After serving in Parliament for 15 years, he worked for a similar period in community service organisation, World Vision and Anglicare before becoming an ordained in the Anglican Church in 2013. So, Lynn, I'd like you to speak through that.
Thanks very much, Doug, and I do have a full copy of my speech to handing out later, because I'll have to cut out some things as I go through. Hell no, we won't go. Stop the war. Peace now. Stop the draft. Lynch Berry. Berry Lynch. We don't want your filthy war. Ho, 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 Chi Minh. What do we want? Peace. Come on. When do we want it? Now! It was 50 years ago, last Friday, that the second of Adelaide's 3 moratorium marches took place. 50 years is a long time. Half a century. September the 18th, 1970 was itself as distant from today as it was from the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, which had concluded the war to end all wars. That war, as we know all too well, had not ended all wars, so there were some 5,000 people massing at the intersection of North Terrace and King William Street, Adelaide, just as many more thousands had done so on Armistice Day in 1918. This time, we had been gathering to stop a war, not to celebrate its stopping. That would take nearly 5 more years. The first moratorium in May 1970 had taken place just over 5 years after Australia's formal commitment to participate in Vietnam, ostensibly at the request of the Saigon regime, but in reality in response to LBJ, with whom we had determined to go all the way.
How many kids you killed today?
Yeah. Yes, the 5 years from that effective declaration of war in 1965 to the mass moratorium marches of 1970 had been a tumultuous time. As a preparation for hostilities, national service had been reintroduced in 1964 with the added provision that conscripts could serve overseas. And so those who were unlucky in the birthday lottery found themselves from the very start amongst those sent to Vietnam. Tragically, in May 1966, the 24th of May, 21-year-old Eric Nowak, a South Australian, became the first Australian conscript to die in the war at the hands of friendly fire. During that war, including during our unofficial involvement from 62 to 65, there had been a total of 500 Australian military personnel killed, 200 of whom were conscripts. There had long been peace groups in South Australia, the Peace Pledge Union and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, for example. But they were relatively small and did not have wide community reach. That is not to say that there wasn't some growing disquiet in the community about events unfolding in Vietnam. For my part, I well recall that as a high school student, being troubled by nightly TV news reports in 1964 about events in Vietnam that were unfolding against the backdrop of the US presidential election of that year, with Republican Barry Goldwater the Hawk saying, "Extremism in defense of liberty is no vice," as he rattled the nuclear saber, countering off against LBJ, who warned electors that in your heart you know that Goldwater might unleash a nuclear war. Johnson the Dove was elected in a landslide, and the following February he unleashed Operation Rolling Thunder, which included the commencement of the bombing of North Vietnam. In response, the peace movement began in earnest in the US. Similarly, Australia's entry into the Vietnam conflict saw some opposition arise here. For example, Save Our Sons was established in 1965 in opposition to conscription. Left-wing trade unions such as the Waterside Workers and the Seamen's Union of Australia were also outspoken against the war, as was the ALP in the lead-up to the 1996 federal election. Then Labour leader Arthur Caldwell had said in Parliament, "We do not think it is a wise decision. We do not think it is a timely decision. We do not think it is a right decision. We do not believe it will promote the welfare of the people of Vietnam. On the contrary, we believe it will prolong and deepen the suffering of that unhappy people, so that Australia's very name may become a term of reproach among them." However, the 1966 federal election saw Labour routed. At that time, the Morgan Gallup polling reported that 61% of Australians were firmly in favour of Australia's commitment to the war and of the draft. The ALP retreated somewhat in its opposition to the war, and into the gap came new groups. The Campaign for Vietnam Protest had been established in 1966. Ali Fricker was a key person in that. And there was the start of radical university groups such as the Students for Democratic Action and Provo. In 1967-68, anti-war activity brought out relatively small numbers of people, and the focus was on headline grabbing, such as the first and controversial anti-war vigil at an Anzac Day dawn service in 1968. Organised by the CBP, it was roundly condemned. While there was increasing radical activity on university campuses, even there, conservatism dominated. An on-the survey of freshers in 1967 found that 75% of males and 67% of females supported involvement in the war. Notwithstanding this, in late '67, the seeds of a mass movement against the war were being planted. Interstate, long-established peace organisations such as the AICD in Sydney and CICD in Melbourne played key roles. But as Malcolm Saunders has noted, it was different in Adelaide. He wrote, "Whereas anti-Vietnam War movements elsewhere were usually organised by established peace groups, South Australia's was launched and sustained by people, particularly students and academics like Neil Blewett, Jeff Harcourt and Brian Medlin, who were initially politically inexperienced as they were idealistic." In July '67, 50 people labelled in the records as prominent came together to establish a mass movement in South Australia, and so the Campaign for Peace in Vietnam was formed. It was a broad church organisation which initially simply opposed Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War, though later would add opposition to conscription as an official goal. A variety of activities would be organised by the CPV, including street demonstrations, candlelight vigils, concerts, art exhibitions, and there would even be another dawn service vigil on Anzac Day, this time organised in consultation with the RSL. The substrate of anti-war activity at this time was respectability. Peter Duncan recalls marching in a three-piece suit along with a furled umbrella at one march. There's a photograph of that on the back of the copy of the speech. He has also forwarded to me a letter which appeared in On D in 1968, which complained about a demonstration which had become, I quote, "an apology for a fancy dress." The correspondents had written, We realise that it is compromising conformist public opinion to dress like the rest of society, and the people who dress like this without aiming to be exhibitionists would consider it hypocritical to change their style of dress. But at the same time, we feel that on such a serious issue, we must try every possible means not to alienate, but to engage public opinion on our side. To appear the same as them externally is probably one way of doing this. Pamphleteering also grew in this period. The Seamen's Union produced a full colour pamphlet protesting the My Lai massacre of that year. And I recall taking some of those to John Martin's where I was working part-time. Not well received. Paradoxically, as community opinion about the war was starting to mellow, with now only 48% supporting the war and 40% opposing by April 1969, demonstration activity itself was causing growing community anger. There were many cases of severe family ructions. Peter Duncan remembers a young law student whose father didn't speak to him for years as a result of having marched. I was fortunate in having a very supportive family. On the occasion of my first arrest in January '68, a nervous friend went to break the news to my father, to which he replied nonchalantly, "Oh yes, we thought that might happen." Those leading the campaign against the war understood that public opinion needed to be changed before government policy might be altered. The CPV was experted in this with its moderate messaging and its reaching out to support beyond university campuses and friendly unions. More than occurred in other states, there was a concerted effort to encourage political engagement through the ballot box with marked results. In '66, Federal Labor had suffered its worst swings in South Australia. At the '69 election, the national swing to Labor was just under 7%, but in South Australia it was 12%, harvesting 8 out of 12 seats, a feat which would never again be achieved. One of those being Stormy Normie, the waterside worker, former wharfie, who won the blue ribbon seat for one term of Sturt. However, radical activity was also organised by groups other than the CPV. For example, in May '69, a group of us held a sit-in at the offices of Labour and National Service Department in Curry Street. After the close of business at 5 p.m, those who remained were invited to leave and then escorted when we declined. I would subsequently refuse to pay the fine for that offence and was sentenced to 5 days in Adelaide jail as a result. A later demonstration at the same office would see animal blood poured over conscription files. Following the success of the '69 election and signs of a dramatic shift in public opinion, which was now 55 to 40 in favour of withdrawal by October '69, representatives of anti-war organisations around Australia met in Melbourne in November of that year to discuss a nationally coordinated campaign. And thus was born the Australian Moratorium movement. I was one of the delegates at that meeting. The Campaign for Peace agreed to sponsor this campaign in South Australia, but cautiously decided to keep it separate organisationally. So then we had 2 organisations with 2 governing bodies, both operating out of the same office in Botanic Chambers, North Terrace. Greg Stevens was appointed the first chair, and I succeeded him in April 1970. There were cultural differences between the 2 cohabiting bodies. Firstly, the CPV had its intellectual heart in the University of Adelaide, whereas the VMC was anchored in the more radical Flinders University, particularly its philosophy department, with Brian Medlin, Greg O'Hare and Rodney Allen. Secondly, governance of the CPV was in an executive that reported to an annual general meeting with a separate body of distinguished patrons. The VMC, on the other hand, had an executive whose authority was constrained by monthly meetings of what were loosely termed members, but in reality consisted of all those who turned up at the AGWA hall in Franklin Street to resolve policy and determine direction each month. I chaired those boisterous meetings, which brought together a couple of hundred people. In fact, I see from the ASIO files, they say 400 on one occasion, so my memories fail on that bit. Made up a broad community representation, but also was notable also for the involvement of the various tendencies of communist opinion, who mostly seemed to dislike each other almost as much as the war. At the end of one particularly difficult meeting, with me still learning the ropes of meeting procedure, I was particularly appreciative when Clyde Cameron came up at the end and said, "Well shared, laddie." Sometimes a bit of lying can mean a great deal. Notwithstanding these culture differences, the two organisations worked very well together until the breach on the eve of the September moratorium. The newly re-elected Labour Premier Dunstan continued his support of the cause which he had already espoused from the less secure position of Leader of the Opposition during the May moratorium. Sylvia Duckhouse was an amazing staff member, supported by David Scoogle was there for a time, myself, and for a shorter period, Rob Durbridge. A significant innovation of the CPV VMC was to arrange for almost every letterbox in the metropolitan area and a number of provincial cities to receive a 3-colour brochure. This was the result of the strong belief in the need to change public opinion in order to sway government policy. Remembering that this was the era when Richard Nixon, in the face of rising anti-war protests in the US, claimed the overwhelming support of the silent majority. We chose to speak to that alleged majority with alternative information. There were also attempts to communicate the message to places where crowds might gather. For example, a motorcade held around the Adelaide Oval to display anti-war posters. Week-long 24-hour vigils held on the steps of Parliament House before both moratoriums, May and September, to attract the attention of passers-by. A Conservative engineering student accosted my late Father Morris, who had volunteered to hand out pamphlets one afternoon at the steps, saying he thought my father would have had better things to do at this time. To which my father replied, "I can think of nothing more important," which was actually wonderful support from a parent who actually was not keen on public demonstrations, but hadn't wanted to let me down. My mother Jean and sister Robin, on the other hand, were frequent and enthusiastic attendees. In May 1970, the Adelaide moratorium was held on a Saturday, unlike Friday opted for in other states. The CPV base of the VMC felt reluctant to adopt the "Stop Work to Stop the War" theme that was followed elsewhere. The 10,000 who attended the Saturday rally would, in other circumstances, have seen the vindication of this caution, except that 100,000 Melbournians had chosen to stop the CBD of that city just the day before. This would result in a lot of reflection within South Australia as to whether the VMC should adopt a more radical approach when the September March came around, namely hold it on Friday and encourage people to take time off work. More than that, however, the monthly meetings wanted the march itself to stop at an intersection. The seeds of discord between the two organisations were thus sowed. History records what happened in summary, and you can see two different front pages of the Advertiser with different numbers of people arrested, I note. But in summary, I as chair and Brian Medlin as deputy felt obliged to arrange for a march to stop at some point on the advertised route from Elder Park to Victoria Square and back. Whilst there was a general expectation that the stoppage would occur on the return leg, Brian and I decided to do it on the first part to maximise the element of surprise. So it was that a relatively short time after leaving Elder Park, where there had been speeches, we stopped at the famous intersection. 400 police were waiting, including police greys. Refusing an order to disperse, the arrest started. I think I was about number 6, and my tally was 138 would be ultimately arrested. In the aftermath, Dunstan called a Royal Commission under Charles Bright to investigate the circumstances of the incident. I and other leaders of the VMC refused to give evidence, as we had not been provided with legal assistance. The Royal Commission took over a year to report, and while critical of us as march organisers, and also of some police behaviour and processes, did recommend positive, landmark changes to demonstration law in this state. The events of September 18 also saw the final and complete rupture of relations between the VMC and the CPV. The former became more radical, adopting a policy to support the NLF, and would hold a third and final moratorium in June 71. However, it also supported the visit to Australia of the leading anti-war activist, Ben Spock. The CPV, for its part, and with new leadership, set about re-establishing a broad-based community opposition to the war, culminating in the July March against the war in 71, at which the Governor, Mark Oliphant, would speak. It would be sometime during this period that I left the VMC and joined the CPV and became its chair until its dissolution after the election of the Whitlam government. Within its first 2 weeks of government, the Whitlam administration had announced the withdrawal of Australian troops, the release of draft resistors, and the abolition of conscription. What do we want?
Peace.
When do we want it? Now! Max Hastings, in his impressive tome, Vietnam, an Epic Tragedy, 45 to 75, quotes a US captain, Walt Boomer, who in 1965 had said, "I fully bought into this thing that communists were going to take over the world and Vietnam was the place to stop them. Even then, the high school kids were saying, this war doesn't make any sense to us, but I thought they were pretty stupid." Years later, and now a general, Boomer would say, "But what was it all about? It bothers me that we didn't learn a lot. If we had, we would not have invaded Iraq."
There will be time for questions and answers. As this is a joint meeting, I now hand over to Derek. But just before doing that, the latecomers, you have to sign in with your name, telephone number and email, and you have to respect the fact we do have to keep 1.5 metres between each other. We're already a little bit overcrowded, so can you just make sure that you do that, or else I might get closed down and I will get arrested again.
Thanks, David. I'm going to be chairing the next section of the meeting. This will be in 3 parts. First, we continue with the speakers from this panel. They are Michael Willis, Judy Gillett-Ferguson, Bill Down and Greg Stevens. Each speaker has 5 minutes for their presentation. Second, we have asked Barry O'Brien to give a 5-minute talk on his Vietnam Marches photos, which are displayed in this room. And Don Longo will introduce Barry. And there are also some statements from Jeff Harcourt and Bruce McFarlane, which will be read out. Third, after the speakers, the audience is invited to give their general reflections of the Vietnam Moratorium with a 2-minute limit for each person. Okay, let's continue with the next speaker. This is Michael Willis. Michael Willis was a participant in the activities against the Vietnam War, including each moratorium march. He refused to register for conscription and established a branch of Draft Resistors Union at Adelaide University. He was also active in the Workers' Student Alliance. Thank you, Mike.
In 1964, I was 13 years old and conscription was introduced. I remember watching a TV program showing pro and anti-conscription demonstrators at Sydney University. I think all of them were in suits and ties. My dad asked me what I thought of the issue. Now, the pro-conscription demonstrators were singing, "The red that we want is the red that we've got in the old red, white and blue." And I thought it was such a catchy tune. I said, "Them, I'm with them." 5 years later, I'm in year 12, got a student underground operating at Henley High, and ASIO opens its first file on me. Part of the files Lynn referred to are on the table. I was a Red myself. 2 of the teachers at my school, Lynn O'Brien and Wendy Durbridge, were married respectively to Peter O'Brien and Rob Durbridge, the leaders of the Students for Democratic Action at Adelaide Uni. So by the time I got to Adelaide Uni, I was quite well versed with all the leading figures on the left in that particular institution. And I was joined there by someone I'd known previously from Melbourne who'd come across here. That's Bill Dowling, sitting two down from me on my right. Now, the Royal Commission that was referred to, the Royal Commissioner in the introduction refers to two different types of motivations behind the anti-war protest. One group regarded the United States basically as a friendly power that had made a tragic mistake, and they could be persuaded to bring the troops home out of Vietnam. The group that I gravitated towards regarded America as an imperialist country and its crimes in Vietnam as arising from the imperialist nature of that country. And as Lynn indicated, there was a split between the two groups, not so much a split, but a difference of how to go about things. We, for our part, believed that we should bring the war home. In other words, we should target American installations and American power in this country and raise, wherever we could, the question of imperialism as a way of putting pressure on the United States to end the conflict in Vietnam. On May the 8th, we decided, this is Durbridge and Keith Darwin over there and a bunch of others at Adelaide Uni, that we would have a pre-moratorium march, a specifically anti-imperialist march, calling for victory for those in Vietnam who were fighting the Americans, victory for the Viet Cong. We'd carry NLF flags, the beautiful yellow star and the red and blue flag on our march. And about 3,000 of us poured out of the back entrance of Adelaide Uni and up H&U Trail to Rundle Street and into King William Street. And as we turned into King William Street, we were viciously assaulted by a group of about 20 drunk soldiers or conscripts from the Woodside Army Base. And their intention was to grab our NLF flags and burn them, and several of them were in fact burnt. The police basically stood by and did nothing, something that's commented on by Commissioner Bright in his reflections on this particular day. But we managed to get back to Adelaide University, and the following day took part in the first moratorium. I was in the front line with a girl from Henley High who carried one of the banners from the day before, Smash Imperialism, Smash US Imperialism in Vietnam. And there was this white-clad, denim-clad person parading in front of me, marshalling the troops, and that was my first introduction, I think, to Brian Medlin, who pretty much became the heart and soul of much of the Vietnam-era protests. That march went off very peacefully, but as part of targeting American imperialism in this country, we had decided to make July the 4th another avenue for protests. And so on July the 4th, we had, I think it was the first July 4th demonstration in Adelaide. And I'm not sure what you did, Bill, but you upset Jock Silverblade and got arrested outside the town hall. And we rocked your divvy van backwards and forwards trying to get you out and couldn't. And were harassed all the way back to Adelaide Uni by the police. And from there we threw some stones at the police, and things got a little bit ugly for a moment. That led to Bill and I being taken off the editorship of Grassroots, the SDA paper at Adelaide Uni. And we set up our own group, SDA ML, because we were the MLs, the Marxist-Leninists. And there was a series of ongoing demonstrations and rallies all the time through 1970 through to 72. So you lose track of some of them. I'm just thankful for my ASIO spies for giving me a detailed diary of everything I was involved in. It was very good of them. September the 18th, as Lynn said, there was a plan to occupy an intersection. The police were told about it, and they refused to give their assent to that. And my memory is that we were going to occupy King William Street, Rundle Street, Conley Street on the way back. But as we set off, or just prior to setting off, Greg O'Hare and Lynn and Brian did the rounds of those of us towards the front and said, look, we're stopping on the way up. We were stopping the intersection of King William Street and North Terrace. So we got there, we did our bit and held the march up, linked our arms, and next thing we knew, there were cops jumping on us from every angle. the backside of my great grey. People were getting their toes trodden on by these horses' hooves. But what really caused panic was that a particular person had brought along a vial of chloropicrine, which is a World War I poison gas, and had released this chloropicrine. So a number of us thought that we were actually being tear gassed by the police, and that added to the panic and people trying to get away, at least from the immediate area I was in, trying to get away. And more, I'm sure that contributed to the large numbers of arrests as people tried to get away from this stinking, eye-burning gas in the air. Anyway, just to cut a long story, which is here in print if you want to take a copy later, out the front here. Conscription. My 20th birthday was 1971. I wasn't a pacifist, I wasn't religious.
Excuse me, what's that? Why not in 5 minutes?
Yeah, I wasn't a pacifist, I wasn't religious. The only defiant thing I could do was not to register. But then my marble came out in the mid-year draft, and I knew I was a person of interest from that point on. In early 1972, I was meant to go to court. I refused to go to court. I went to Melbourne for some months. But the court, there were 4 of us up before the courts, and a group from Adelaide Uni United brought along stink bombs, and the whole of the magistrates' court had to be closed down because these stink bombs just wafted through all of the magistrate court area. And you know, I could have got away probably without being prosecuted on that day, but as it was, I went to Melbourne for a couple of months, came back here in July in time for July 4th, and the rest is in the paper.
So I need to mention, first is an apology from Judy Gillis, that's right. I'm so disappointed that I will not be able to attend to a family.
The only eagle, my apologies,
Sorry.
we only
That's you. Yeah. Yeah. The only eagle, that's right. That's right. It's true. I'm so disappointed that I will not be able to attend due to a family event. I would have loved to have been there. I remember the strong drama of the event in which Graham participated. Please give my apologies and remember me to Lynn. And the second thing is that you might have noticed these little flies, the personal fact sheet. If you're involved in getting a moratorium, please fill it out and then pop it into this bin. Okay. Thank you. Okay, now Judy. Judy is almost 81 and a lifelong socialist and unionist. Between 1960 and 1994, she was variously a full-time teacher, deputy principal, education advisor and principal for all her teaching career, and an active unionist and an area president for several years. Her 4 children were all born in the 1960s, during which time she was also an activist in the women's liberation movement. Thank you, Judy.
Thank you. I'm just having to follow Lynn. They say one thing worse than following an ex-politician is to follow a minister of the church. So Lynn and I go back quite a long way too, which is lovely. As early as 1964, the Communist Party of Australia and its sister organisation, the Union of Australian Women, publicly opposed the war in Vietnam. Many of the women then active in both those organisations, and I was one of them, had produced the generation of baby boomers who would soon become potential war fodder in that dreadful war. I came into the anti-Vietnam War movement in Adelaide via the Communist Party and the Union of Australian Women, and it was 1965 and I was 26 and had 3 preschool children and was expecting my 4th. I had been involved in anti-A-bomb leafleting and letterboxing and Hiroshima Day marches for several years already, and I'd like to just mention that I brought some photographs on that table over there of me heavily pregnant marching with my then husband Bill and our firstborn in a Hiroshima Day march in 1962. Women and women's organisations played an important role in the anti-war movement that over the years has, I think, often been underestimated. I'm talking about older women, I'm not talking about student women here. Their entry into the Moratorium movement was triggered in large part by the introduction of the infamous National Conscription Lottery in 1965. As you all know, young men reaching 20 had their names in this lottery. Those drawn out were sent to fight in Vietnam unless they were brave enough to be conscientious objectors. And the first Australian conscript to lose his life was an Adelaide man, Private Errol Nowak. He died, now believed, as Lynn has mentioned, to be from friendly fire. That's an ironic term if ever there was one. Only 2 weeks after arriving in Vietnam. His death caused an outcry amongst many, particularly in the South Australian community, and especially among women who had sons of the same age. This disgraceful process continued unabated until Gough Whitlam was elected Prime Minister some 7 years later in 1972, by which time 521 Australian servicemen's lives had been lost and 3,000 more were injured or poisoned by Agent Orange, and over 58,000 US soldiers were dead or missing and many thousands more injured. The numbers of Vietnamese civilians and military from both North and South who also lost their lives in this terrible war, or were mutilated, burned and uprooted, is in the several millions, quite apart from the rape of women, irrevocably poisoned countryside and the loss of farmland and social infrastructure. Shockingly, the incidence of crippling wounds and amputations was 300% higher in this war than those suffered in World War II, and 61% of those killed or injured were under 21 years of age. The mounting death rate and terrible destruction of the country was hidden as much as possible. But for the first time, television brought this war into the homes of Americans and Australians alike, and it couldn't be censored for long. I believe the daily televising of the war, a first for us, helped inform the population as a whole and helped them to see for the first time the brutality and stupidity of war and its horrendous consequences for both sides, and especially the civilian population. It helped to turn the tide against the war, I believe. The moratoriums and other protests were well televised as well, so that people could see the groundswell against the war. Not just lefties and students, but middle-aged mothers as well. The Union of Australian Women was closely affiliated, as I said, with the Communist Party, and throughout the war we held weekly peace days and regular peace vigils, often in conjunction with other women's groups like Save Our Sons and the Women's League for Peace and Freedom. Many UAW members also became members of Save Our Sons and provided them with much needed political experience and support. UAW and SOS members held a silent vigil at Adelaide Airport in 1965 to protest against the sending of the first contingent of conscripts to Vietnam. They expected to be arrested, but instead their photo was taken by the newspaper and they were invited to appear on Channel 9's A Current Affair. Regular anti-war vigils were also held at the offices of federal MPs, and at these vigils the women wore specially made aprons with anti-war slogans and Save Our Sons painted on them. This got round the law against holding placards. The UAW had decided at its national meeting in 1964 to oppose the war, and from then on it worked closely with the SOS and other women's and peace groups like the Women's League for Peace and Freedom to fight against conscription and the war generally. The Save Our Sons group were first formed in Sydney in May 1965 and within weeks in every capital city. It was specifically formed to protest conscription and the National Service Lottery, and later to protect and assist draft resistors and conscientious objectors in court and both within and outside of prison. We were particularly concerned about young men conscripts who were not then eligible to vote. I knew several draft resistors who were in hiding and supported by family, friends and women's groups. Most SOS members were working or middle-class women with no former connection to political parties or radical organisations. We were much maligned in the media as hysterical mothers with nothing better to do, or as communist dupes, or as bimbos. In his book, Harvest of Fear, A History of Australia's Vietnam War, John Murphy describes the early anti-war groups like SOS as distinctly genteel, concerned with, in commas, respectability, with a strong faith in liberal democracy and the piercing light of rational argument. This is, I think, a little unfair and simplistic, as most SOS members were quick learners and became creative and courageous activists in a very short time, despite their lack of experience at the beginning. The age demographic of SOS women were mainly older than me, as they had sons in their 20s, and so were in their 40s. Very few of those women are sadly still with us today. The contribution of SOS and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom campaigns against conscription and to the mass movement against war was tremendous and should never be underestimated. We learned quickly how to raise funds, organise and address public meetings, rallies, teach-ins and protest marches. Along the way we were abused, assaulted, arrested and some are even jailed, as in Melbourne on Easter Thursday 1971, when 5 members of the SOS were arrested for handing out anti-conscription pamphlets. The women spent 14 days in Fairlea prison and became known as the Fairlea Five. Their successful campaign against the law prohibiting distributing leaflets in the street became an important victory and later made into a film, which I'll talk about in a minute. The dignity and determination of the SOS women in the face of official repression did much to win sympathy and respect for their cause amongst unions, the general public and eventually the Labour Party and the media. The waterside workers, Seamen's Union and other progressive unions worked closely with the women's organisations, especially if the union had an active women's committee. The Seamen's Union of Australia stopped the Jeparet, which was a freighter, from taking equipment to the war and produced a coloured leaflet showing the horrendous effects of napalm on the bodies of children. The Australian Government Workers' Union, through its secretary Jim Thompson, had their members, who were prison officers, refuse to imprison conscientious objectors. Many of the women opposed to the war were members of church groups, particularly the Quakers and the Uniting Church, who were very supportive of conscientious objectors. Okay, I'm just about finished. Okay. And totally against war in general. Under the umbrella of the Vietnam Moratorium Committee, all these organisations united with academic and student groups. The Women's International League for Peace and Freedom was another organisation that I've mentioned. Though not I mentioned this film, I'll just say that quickly. It was produced in 1996 by Ronin Films and directed by Rebecca McLean and produced by Elisa Argencio. The women's liberation movement, which I joined in 1970, had some of its seeds in the anti-war moratorium movements, but I don't think it segued smoothly and easily from the SOS movement without further political struggles. Despite their important politicisation during the anti-Vietnam War campaign, few of those older women transitioned into the women's liberation movement. It took another generation of younger women to take up that struggle and for the personal to become truly political. But that's another story.
Thank you very much, Jim. Okay, our next speaker is Bill Dowling. Bill was involved at Monash University in the first attempt to raise funds for the National Liberation Front. Then he moved to Adelaide in 1970 and worked in the Vietnam Moratorium campaign. Over to you, Bill.
Thanks, Derek. A little bit of an anecdote first, following on from what Michael said. When I was in that police van that he talked about when I was arrested on one of the moratorium marches, he described it quite accurately. My comrades were outside rocking the van and shouting and free Bill and smash US imperialism. You may be interested to know that what was actually going through my mind was, what if those buggers turn the van over and it catches fire? I'll be incinerated. Now, before I talk about the small incident that Michael asked me to speak about today, just following on and notwithstanding Lynn's very good analysis of the various groups involved in bringing together the moratorium, I want to say that the moratorium itself, the moratorium movement, was a wonderful example of how that nebulous thing that we all like to call the left, the progressives, can come together and operate and achieve some real change. It was a wonderful example of that. We tended to be very sectarian in our different ways, for all sorts of reasons, often very good reasons. But the Vietnam moratorium movement as a whole enabled us to put that sort of sectarianism behind us, if only for a short time, and possibly only because the times allowed it. The times were times in which the times really were a changing, as Bob Dylan said. There were times in which there was a huge groundswell of opinion against the awful things that the Yanks were doing in Vietnam. But to return to the actual incident that Michael asked me to talk about at Monash, I was a student at Monash in 1967 and a member of the Labour Club. And the Monash Labour Club became quite infamous at that time. And the first thing it did that helped it to gain infamy, I may say, was not the aid collections for the National Liberation Front that were raised on campus. It was giving a degree to a pig, which we did in protest against the university, Monash, awarding an honorary degree to an awful little premier of the time. Not all premiers are awful, but an awful premier of the time in Victoria called Sir Henry Balti. An awful little man who was a great proponent, and I think often for very personal reasons of his own, really wanted to hang someone, and in the end managed to hang someone, a great proponent of capital punishment. When the university decided to give him an honorary degree, the Labour Club awarded a degree to a pig. It was great publicity, and the irony was that Balti was in fact a pig farmer out of the Western District near where I come from. So that didn't go down too well. Then the Labour Club decided that it would collect money for Australia's ostensible enemy, the people that our boys were fighting in Vietnam. An act of treason in the eyes of many. We did that. A table was set up in the student union area, and I was only peripherally involved in this. Two other students, Michael Hyde and Albert Langer, and I'm sure you've heard of these people, especially Albert, were the ones who decided to do the collection. In an excess of youthful spontaneity, I joined them, and the three of us were involved in the disciplinary action that resulted from that later on. Most students at the university were strongly opposed to what we did, but it was interesting to see how public opinion at the university swung in later times. One of the great reactions to the collection of aid for the NLF was a mass meeting at the University of students, organised not by the Labour Club or by the Students' Representative Council, but by, of all organisations, the Democratic Labour Party Club. Now, you know, you're all Labour historians. You know what the DLP was. The DLP was the result of the cataclysmic schism that occurred in the Australian Labour Party when the extreme right-wing elements of the party left and formed the Democratic Labour Party, which was initially called, as I recall, the Anti-Communist Labour Party, heavily backed by the Catholic Church, heavily backed by the National Civic Council and the dreadful Bob Santa Maria in Melbourne. And they had a club, quite a strong, or certainly a very active little club, on the Monash University campus in the mid-1960s. They organised a mass meeting of students to take the Monash Labour Club to task for collecting money for the NLF, and it backfired on the DLP. In a brilliant tactical move, Albert Langer, as I recall, said that the motion that should be moved at the mass meeting would be a motion dissociating the major body of students from the action of collecting aid for the NLF. The Labour Club supported that motion, even though it was moved by someone else, and it completely cut the ground from under the Democratic Labour Party Club, and also the university's administration, led by Vice-Chancellor Matheson, who later disciplined us for actually collecting the money. There was a move there, as we saw a move within the Moratorium movement in subsequent years, to what you might call the left. Langer, who is a very articulate, a very perceptive guy, was interviewed some years later, and the question he was asked was collecting money for the NLF, did it give the anti-war movement greater politicisation? Langer said it had two effects. It changed the character of the anti-war movement. Everybody moved to the left. Most people hadn't supported the NLF. It was a pacifist movement till then. Drastically changed. People moved on from saying the war was a mistake to saying it was immoral. Those that were saying it was immoral moved on to saying it was imperialist. Now, the other thing that happened is that things like that collection of aid to the NLF and the chanting of overtly anti-imperialist slogans on the Moratorium marches tended to move people to the left, but they also created a bit of a vacuum, and people who had previously not even considered marching on a demonstration or even opposing a war in which their country was involved moved in to occupy a bit of a vacuum from what you might call the right. Yeah, now, I don't know whether this justifies everything that the more extreme elements of the Moratorium group, the more lefty elements, like myself at the time, did, but it's an interesting question, and I'll leave it to you to decide whether you think it was overall a good thing to do or not. But just to finish on the question of the Moratorium marches and the way in which this extreme, if you like, leftist action influenced them, it was probably most visible in the slogans that were chanted during the marches. And I know that we actively campaigned and organised to change the nature of the slogans from the more pacifist ones, like 2, 4, 6, 8, stop the war, negotiate, to 2, 4, 6, 8, the US must capitulate, or peace now, from the pure pacifist movement, peace now versus Ho Chi Minh, the NLF
is going to win, which I may say it did. And I may also say, and I still believe this to be the case, that slogans like the NLF is going to win and the US must capitulate most accurately reflected the best way to bring the war to a conclusion, which was to have the US militarily defeated by the forces that it was opposing. I think that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Bill. Now, our final speaker is Greg Stevens. Greg was an active member of the Campaign for Peace in Vietnam executive for many years. He was also the first elected chairperson of the Vietnam Moratorium Coordinating Committee before handing over to Lynn Armour. His efforts were mainly directed at marshalling, the ALP and trade union support for the moratorium. He is a life member of the Labour history of South Australia.
Thanks, Derek. Here today we look back on the impact of the anti-war movement from about 1967 to 1973 here in South Australia and nationally on one of those unwinnable, brutal and divisive wars that this country has got involved in since the Second World War. Lest we forget, that saying not only applies to those who fought and died, but also to those who fought peacefully against this war. We won't forget today those comrades and friends who marched alongside of us during those years and are now no longer with us. My own involvement in the peace movement didn't begin until 1967. I had a lot to learn about the strategies that we needed to engage in to bring the community with us. The Campaign for Peace in Vietnam was my entry point. My political and trade union experience, although then limited, I believe, gave me the ability and motivation to make some sort of contribution. In 1967, the vast majority of Australians appeared to have bought the line peddled by the Menzies-Holt governments that we had to stop the downward thrust of communism from Vietnam or we ourselves would be engulfed, even if that required us to enlist voteless 20-year-olds to do the dirty work for us. So the birth of the CPV saw that one of its main objectives was to oppose the use of conscripts for national service overseas. By 1970, it was acknowledged, I think, by most of us in the CPV that a broader-based force was needed to make a greater impact on the decision makers and the community. And so the Vietnam Moratorium campaign was born, not only here but across the nation and overseas. The tide of public opinion was changing, demonstrated in 1969 by the fall of 5 Conservative seats in South Australia to the ALP. The peace movement then had to adapt and adopt new strategies. It had also to bring the political and industrial components along with it, together with students and those who had not been active before. Right from the start, the VMC was democratically based. All decisions of any importance had to be ratified or otherwise by general meetings. The constituency of those general meetings varied from time to time, and I recall there was no particular time limit placed on debate. So generally speaking, the then older generation had had enough by about 10:30 p.m. and had to stay on in case their vote was needed later, which it often was. Now, I particularly want to say something about the ALP participation in the September 1970 moratorium. The issue was brought forward fairly and squarely by John Scott, then Secretary of the AEU, and myself in the party forums, so that the outcome would be binding on the party and its members. The wording of the resolution as carried ended, quote, "This convention calls upon all members, affiliates and branches to actively support the proposed moratorium activities in September," end of quote. There was, I think, an assumption within the party that these activities would be similar to those of the May moratorium. However, for example, at that point there had not been a decision made regarding an occupation of an intersection of city streets for a number of hours. By the time the decision was made, it had become apparent that some ALP members and the government itself were becoming apprehensive about these arrangements. At a general meeting of the VMC held only 10 days before the demonstration, the final proposals of the coordinating committee were rejected. So it then became clear to the ALP that the VMC was steering a course that could bring it into collision with police. The following day, the ALP State Executive, after receiving a report from Executive members John Scott, David Coombe and myself, resolved to disassociate the branch from the moratorium activities of 18th September. As it transpired, the efforts of the Dunstan Labor government to persuade the Commissioner of Police to disregard any civil breaches of the law with respect to public and traffic flows fell on deaf ears. The final decision as to occupation of a specific city intersection was then made by Brian Medlin and Lynn Arnold. As we all know, what actually occurred on the 18th of September became the subject of a Royal Commission. An evaluation of the Commissioner's report is probably worthy of a meeting by itself. Suffice to say that the report's recommendations regarding changes to the Police Offences Act and the status of the Commission of Police vis-à-vis the government of the day were subsequently adopted by the government. Thereafter, the work of the VMC and the CPV continued into 1971 and 1972. In late 1972, the Whitlam Labor government was elected, conscription of 20-year-olds was abolished, the troops came home, the people of Vietnam were left to pick up the pieces. And now, 50 years later, have we listened and have we learned? No. Thank you.
Okay, now that's the panel session that's finished. Now we have some statements from Jeff Harcourt, Bruce McFarlane and Chris White, and Don Longo is going to read out the statement from Jeff Harcourt. Thanks.
Those of you that know Jeff Harcourt was taught economics at the University of Adelaide in 1958 and then in Cambridge from 1982 to 1998. He currently lives in Sydney and gives his great apologies for not being able to come. He's fairly old and frail, and the virus just put an end to his plans. So he asked me, I talked about this for a number of times. He said, could you read out the statement on my behalf, and I agreed to do so. Three people are mentioned in this statement, which I should mention myself. And one is Brian Medlin, whom you know, and the Professor of Philosophy at Flinders University and Chair of the CPV. The other is Neil Blewett, who taught politics at Adelaide and Flinders Universities in the 60s and 70s, and was later a minister in the Hawke and Keating governments. And of course, Hugh Stretton is also mentioned, who was an economic historian at Adelaide University. So Jeff asked me to say the following. Medlin and the others were Maoists as well as Marxists. I was in the anti-Vietnam War protests with Neil Blewett, but he and I were moderates. Our aim was to get Australians out of Vietnam and stop conscription. Since the Australian Labor Party supported both these policies, our strategy was to get the ALP elected. The ALP was in any case ambivalent about the movement. Even the ALP sympathisers among the protesters were a motley crew. This was not unusual at the time, as other Adelaide progressives like Hugh Stretton were very ambivalent of the moratorium movement. Medlin, in contrast, with his supporters in the campaign for peace in Vietnam, wanted the Australian Revolution first. Don't worry later about getting the boys out of Vietnam. Medlin was something of an exhibitionist, and getting the boys and with a martyr complex, dressing like as a Christ-like figure, a difficult militant, and also unreliable. At a personal level, I got on with him all right, but he let me down in the famous September 1970 moratorium, using my reputation as a moderate to say that if some protesters didn't want to sit down, that would be okay, since the march would break off at a certain street. It was to be somewhere along King William Street, probably between North Terrace and Victoria Square somewhere, but not at the North Terrace intersection. Hence, parents with prams and older people agreed to march but not sit down. However, Redland's promise proved to be a lie. Everyone, as a result, was caught in the melee, exacerbated by the tossing of a canister containing some First World War gas that made the horses go crazy and endangered the lives of peaceful protesters. I felt very let down by that incident. My argument was that if you'd gone through all the usual channels and that didn't work, then you were justified in taking direct action, provided you didn't whinge. For example, should the law catch up with you and arrest you for breaking the law, that would be legitimate. However, if the police beat you up, that's not legitimate. Nonetheless, I was on very good terms with the police in Adelaide, which is a very small place. The police were actually very antagonistic to start off with, but ended up not being too bad. Most of them were on working class backgrounds. They really didn't like the privileged middle class protesters. The Asian young man who spied on me was a son-in-law of one of my colleagues in the economics department. That's Adelaide for you. You've already experienced it. I found out I was being spied upon because my wife, Joan, who actually ran for the ALP seat in 1968, I think. 68. My wife, Joan, quickly worked out our phone was being tapped. She could hear them click on as she took most of the phone calls with me being out and about on anti-war activities. During the Royal Commission on the September Moratorium incidents, I was in the witness box for 2 days giving evidence. That's what I want to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Don. The next statement is Bruce McFarlane. Lynn will read that out. Thank you.
It's rotten being the last speaker, but at least I get to stand up second to last. Just before reading Bruce McFarlane's statement, I was a very young, very naive Teachers College student and participated in both moratoriums. My father, he never forgave me and my life was over, according to him. Okay, Bruce McFarlane taught politics in Adelaide Uni in the 70s and political economy in the 1980s. It is difficult to get nostalgic about it is difficult not to get nostalgic about the moratorium activities at the time of the Hitler-loving Marshal Key of Vietnam, Yank Vice President Spiro Agnew. On the other side, I recall Arthur Caldwell's attempts to get the Holt government to see reason on the genocidal tactics being used by the US armed forces. As an active member of the moratorium, I did a speaking tour of the eastern states with Dr. Jim Cairns and always got a good response. Cairns is, of course, responsible for the biggest demonstration against the war ever held in Melbourne, or possibly anywhere. Some big statements here. Taking part in the moratorium in Sydney, I discovered that the New South Wales coppers were turning into active enemies of protesters and were using violence all the time. A wily secret police officer, Fred Longbottom, had been assigned to confront us, which he did with personal satisfaction. Important was the unity of different political trends for which Bob Gould was responsible. This was quite a feat, with Social Democrats, left Liberals and Marxists working for the goals of ending the war and for the abandonment of military conscription. Proponents of social change can learn a lot from the unity during the moratorium. I need to thank the following people for their gigantic contributions during the Canberra moratoriums: Helen Jarvis, Dee Hunter, Julia Ryan and the amazing Megan Stoyles. I hope that's the right pronunciation. For more history in South Australia, one should contact Emeritus Professor G.C. Harcourt. Sincerely yours, Bruce McFarlane, Christchurch. And Derek Burke managed to source this statement through Humphrey McQueen, distributed to members. Thank you.
Okay, the final statement is from Chris White, that'll be read out by Doug.
And because we're slipping a bit behind, I won't read it all out. For those that don't know Chris, he was Secretary of the UTLC. He's now a retired unionist and peace activist living in Melbourne, and I know from my conversations he was really wanting to be here today, but unfortunately he's locked in his flat. Just a few highlights from his paper, and the whole paper will be published in whatever we're going to be doing. I thought, Sam, do you want a drink? And meant lift this up. He was called up in 1966 in the conscription ballot, and he started to focus his mind and his actions. He started a law arts degree, and that meant delaying it, but he was so short-sighted, he was no good in the army. So he didn't get in. He must have been very disappointed. He then studied law at the Adelaide University, where he listened and understood the Vietnam War. From 1966 onwards, he absorbed with anti-Vietnam War struggle being undertaken by US students. His early activities included door knocking and debating the US intervention and peace ethnics. Still at the law school, he submitted for international law, which he considered. He put up a very good argument to say as to why the US actions were illegal. However, my professor, who was also advising the Australian government, did not agree with me and marked me down. A bit of censorship. I'll skip a whole lot of other. He recalls walking in rallies and carrying the banner, Power to the People, and singing Lennon's anthem. We also sung Imagine and This is Christmas. Everyone's favourite was, of course, Country Joe and the Fish, a chant, we don't give a damn, next stop is Vietnam. 1, 2, 3, 4, what are we fighting for? We don't want your fucking war. We were also crowd favourites. Rob Durbridge and the Communist Party were great as our key speakers on many occasions. He was also involved, of course, in the great sit-down in the middle of the road. That's really, I think, the highlights of it. And as I say, the whole 5 pages will be included in whatever we come out with.
Now we invite the audience to get... Oh, sorry, yes. Barry. Okay, sorry. Okay, Barry O'Brien, the famous photographer, on the day of September the 18th, has some photos for us and to explain them. Maybe could you give a bit of an intro to Barry and Don?
I eventually got in touch with Barry, and he agreed to come and talk about his experiences in 1970, as well as show some of his photos. A couple of things though. You're welcome to take photos of the photos, but for copyright reasons you mustn't publish them. And he'll explain himself for the reason for it. But those of you who don't know Barry O'Brien was a photographer in the Advertiser for 46 years, from 1957, I think it was. Mostly doing sporting photos from the late 50s to the early 70s, but then he became a general photographer for all sorts of stories. He's a multi-award winner. He got the 4 times award for the best photo in the Grand Prix, which was something. And he still works as a travel writer for various newspapers, including the Western Australian and the New Zealand Herald. So I'll pass to him, and he can talk about the photos himself.
Thank you very much, Don. Yes, well, Don said to me when I bring along some photos, and he said, well, perhaps you'd like to talk about it from a completely different aspect to what you've been hearing already. And I'm now shit scared because I hope I've got all my facts right after such eloquent speakers before me. But on any big occasion, the photographers were usually given a briefing or pep talk by pictorial editor Stan James before heading off. Positions were allotted, but when the event was actually happening, it's left for each photographer to get to the heart of the action. We had no prior knowledge of any police action, and as far as I can remember, I didn't know that an intersection was going to be occupied. While all the other photographers attached long lenses, I decided to use an ultra-wide 20mm lens and get in as close to the protesters as possible. These were the days before motor drives and autofocus, so you had one shot. Feelings were running high and trouble was expected. About 5,000 men, women and children linked arms and set off 14 abreast from Elder Park in good spirits. During the early part of the march, the mood was largely good-natured as anti-war slogans were chanted and peace songs sung. There was some jeering from people on the footpath. Scuffles along the way were initiated by men reportedly with RSL badges. Placards were grabbed and ripped. With 6 police cage cars and a black Mariah all loaded with uniformed police preceding them, the marchers reached the intersection of King William Street and North Terrace. The leaders halted and the group closed ranks, jammed shoulder to shoulder to block the intersection. They sat down. Superintendent Ted Calder, through a megaphone, demanded the marchers keep moving. After giving time to react and with no further movement happening, he climbed on the bonnet of a police car and announced that he had the power to maintain the orderly control of the intersection. This time his tone was more forceful. He ordered the protesters to disperse. There was much jeering from within the ranks of the marchers. A minute later, he announced police had the power to arrest anyone not complying with his order. There was a large presence of plain-clothed as well as uniformed police. The tension in the air was electric as uniformed police surrounding the group passed an instruction from one to another along the line. As each constable received the message, they produced chin straps for their hats, which were buttoned and tightened. The mounted police moved in closer. It was hard to believe this was happening in Adelaide. Until the hats were strapped down tight, I imagined things would sort themselves out. But when that happened, I knew all hell was going to break loose. My sights were firmly fixed on Professor Medlin. With his long flowing hair, he was the most visual of the protesters. It didn't take long for the order to be given. Police charged in to make arrests. Medlin was the first one grabbed. With my wide-angle lens, I positioned myself as close as I possibly could to the action. Medlin was yelling no violence as he was dragged, pushed and lifted unceremoniously to a paddy wagon. While yelling, he was kicking out and resisting with all his might. I had one chance to get the perfect dramatic shot. As he neared the cage car, supported and dragged by police, his feet launched in the air, trying to jam them either side of the entrance to stop being placed inside, but it was to no avail. I was wearing a suit, which the advertiser preferred, unlike the protesters who were mainly in jeans and casual clothes. On a number of occasions, at different demonstrations around that time, because of the suit, I was accused of being from Asia. In the mayhem, with men and women screaming and yelling, I was grabbed by a couple of young cops and dragged toward the cage car. Above the noise, I yelled at those dragging me that I was from the advertiser. Just as I was about to be loaded, an older sergeant stopped them. They reluctantly let me go and charged back into the fray. I looked around at a sickening sight. Police and protesters grappled on the ground, while women and children were screaming hysterically as they were ushered away. A large crowd of onlookers cheered the police as they carried or dragged young men away to be placed in the cage car and taken to the city watch house. I've written a little bit about the next moratorium. Less than 12 months later, protests turned to bloody clashes. I've got July the 1st. Was it July the 1st or July the 4th? July the 1st, I've got. Oh,
It would be July 4th.
Okay. Was an incredible day of violence in Adelaide. Not only was there a moratorium march, but also the Springboks came to town to play rugby at Lord Oval at night. Many of the afternoon's protesters continued out to North to support the anti-apartheid movement. While the September 1970 demonstration was an orderly march until the occupation of the section, this one, sorry, you're responsible, was not as well organised or united. After a 2-hour meeting in Victoria Square, the march moved off and wound its way through the city streets for a couple of hours in a seemingly random way. There were confrontations along the way, and fragmented groups broke away from the main bunch and went their own way. There seemed to be a desire to occupy Rundle Street before it was a mall, of course. But police, through a loudspeaker, advised them they would not be permitted to enter the street. "You've had a fair crack of the whip," said Senior Inspector W.T. Blythe as he directed them to move on to North Terrace. "We want Rundle Street, we want Rundle Street," came the chant. As I followed the different groups, drama was unfolding in front of me. Back at Rundle Street, a breakaway group was in a standoff confrontation with a dozen or more police cyclists. My strong case with the extra lenses in it was used to stand on to get enough height to make a dramatic picture, which was there. Again, the 20mm wide-angle lens made all the difference. After processing my film, I was rostered to finish at 5 p.m, but there was no way I was going to miss the action at Melbourne Oval.
I was working at Peter Jonas. I was a boilermaker welder at the time, amongst other things. And the fellows were quite interested in the fact that some of them were going to an anti-war rally, because not many of them thought about it, and in some instances were opposed to those rallies. But then a couple of weeks later, well no, it was only a couple of days later, we were sent to a place at Gilman to install a factory for CSL. And there was a group, there was boilermakers, there was riggers, there was fitters and turners, and one of the fitters and turners, a big bloke, was very critical of the people on the march. He was suggesting that the students should be sacked from the university, along with the academics. It was pretty nasty. And I'm sitting there thinking, how much rope am I going to give this bloke before I hang him? And I let him go, and in fact the acting foreman let lunch go 20 minutes longer, because he was enjoying the discussion, I might put it that way. And then after about 15 minutes of this bloke, I decided it was time to act. And I asked him, what do you think of the Vietnamese people running their own country? And they got rid of the French at D&B and Food in 1954. And now they're dealing with the Americans who are killing millions of people. And he was saying, well, he said, what needs to happen is the Americans need to drop 3 atom bombs, one in the north, one in central Vietnam and one in the south. And that describes the sort of person he was. However, I finished arguing with him, and the acting foreman thought it was time we should be back on the job after 20 minutes over lunch. I hadn't gone very far, and one of the older chaps tapped me on the shoulder, and he said, "Hey, Tommy, that was fantastic, what you said about that bastard." And I said, "Oh yeah." He said, "Hey, you're a member of the Communist Party, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Oh, that's good, because I buy Tribune on Saturday morning in Port Adelaide." And so he ran up to the job, and I went a bit further, and the other old chap came up to me, and he said, "Oh, thank goodness you gave that bastard a hard time." He said, "You're a member of the Communist Party, aren't you?" I'm getting a bit bored with this. And I said, "Yeah, that's right." He said, "Oh, that's good. Hey, listen, can you get me the Tribune?" I said, "Yeah, I can do that. That's fine. That's fine." And then I got back to the corner where I was working, and the young bloke, he's my age, anyway. His father was the foreman in the border shop. And Barry said to me, oh, he said, it's great what you did to that bloke, fantastic. He said, I subscribe to the Communist Party newspaper. I said, oh, terrific. Yeah, he said, you know that shop in High Street? I said, is that the shop sort of down towards the end of High Street? He said, yeah, that's the one. And I think, yeah, I go there every week. Actually, I didn't tell him that. He said, I go there every week, every Saturday when I'm in town, because it's a great bookshop, and I got to get a lot of stuff from him. But the point about it was that though there were workers who were opposed to the war, they weren't initially like the idea of rallies and noisy rallies, because I see a lot of it on telly and the way the coppers dealt with the protesters. I heard that there was a rally happening by the radical left student movement one afternoon, and I knocked off work. I went and got Larry Hickman from the Boilermakers to take him down to the square. And I'm pointing out the plainclothes cops around the square holding rolled up newspapers. And I said, see them, Larry, they're the plainclothes coppers. Just watch and see what happens. Sure enough, what do you reckon? They all moved in together and built a shed out of the protesters. But in the advertisement the next morning, you'd have thought it was a student that was building the cops. Shocker. Thanks.
Thank you. Andy?
Thank you, Derek. It's great being here 50 years after all you political bikies were back raping democracy on the streets of Australia. I think thank you to all the speakers. I think you've all been tremendous in giving us some really good perspectives of what happened all those years ago. I spent no moratorium years in Adelaide because I was living in Sydney, but I was a member of the campaign for peace in Vietnam from I think 67 to 69, and I was in a household that helped shelter a draft dodger, Danny Nicholas, and I studied with another draft dodger, Rob Hall, who sadly is no longer with us. I kept in touch with him on and off for quite a number of years. And Chaz Martin, who I played basketball with, the friendly men, the boys that stay together, play together. No, other way around. The other thing I wanted to mention was taking up the comment about the Catholic Church. I was president of the Student Christian Movement at Adelaide Uni in 1969. I said I'd only take the position if we could go into the peace movement against the war in Vietnam. And not too many people wanted to be president anyway. So I became it, and we started to get involved with signing up the Archbishop of Adelaide, maybe the Catholic one and the Anglican one for service in Vietnam. We also organised an Asian affairs group which was working in churches to get people to see how wrong the war in Vietnam was. And ironically, the first place we went to was Jeff Harcourt's church, Roseville Methodist as it then was, and he spoke about the economic problems of Asia, and Bob Catley, remember Bob? Yeah. He spoke about the social and political problems of Southeast Asia, and despite his views later, he did say that the social and political problems of Southeast Asia were us, the Western world. I just thought I should mention that, but later, when I was in Sydney, of course, I was there for 3 years for the moratoriums there, and the police were much heavier, as Bob has outlined, and I was there the day they went through a plate glass window as well.
Recognise that.
And I had a few interesting problems with the coppers on that day and other times as well. I think a very scary thing was poster pasting. I can remember poster pasting in the town hall station, came across a digger and he said, I come from Croatia. And he said, I hate you bastards. And he said, if I had it done with me now, you and the other person with me would both be dead. So I'm pretty certain that he was probably a secret Stasi sort of person. But through that, my experiences in Sydney, I met some quite left-wing Catholics. And although I'm not religious at all now, I think it's important to be aware that there is a Catholic worker movement, or there was, in this country, and it was much stronger in the United States. And I think they were very much part of the peace movement in the United States. I won't go on about that, but here we put out I work with a group of people that put out a magazine called Retrieval. Some of you might remember that. And most of those people were left-wing Catholics, and they did a great job. But I think that the Vietnam years helped change the politics of many. They certainly helped refine my politics. And I think it's just great being here and sharing our thoughts together today. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, unfortunately, we have to cut it off there. We're running out of time. Now I'm going to hand back to Doug, and he's going to conduct the Q&A.
Just before you do, can I say that there's 75 each of these badges, the September Moratorium one and Artists for Peace. They're here for the taking, so they're here, and also copies of my speech if you want.
So I'm going to have a Q&A little session for about 20 minutes, because we're supposed to be out here by 4, so that's not going to happen. If you're going to ask a question, can you just leave this or take them around? If you're going to ask a question, can you not make a statement? Can you just ask a question? And I will ask the panel to sort of answer it as simply as possible. So, first question. Yes, back.
So you mentioned...
Can we just have some silence, please? Thank you. Yes.
So you mentioned that there were unions that were sympathetic to the anti-war movement. Were there a lot of strikes that were explicitly on the basis of anti-war?
So I guess the question is, were the unions involved and did they actually strike for peace? Anyone want to answer?
Well, they certainly were very actively involved. The Siemens Union, I mentioned, the waterside workers, the Amalgamated Engineering Union, the Boilermakers, as it then was, as before they became the AMWU and then the AMWSU, etc., etc. Whether there were some work meetings at different places around the country, and certainly in the state there were some major stoppages to do with the war. The Japan has been mentioned as something with the Siemens Union were involved, and the waterside workers did do different activities on moratorium days and other days. Don, you might want to talk more about that.
I did mention the public service workers who struck at the jail, or reduced to jail, the conscriptees.
I can remember walking down on a march, going down Rundle Street towards East Terrace, passing the then Labourers Union's office, and Liz Robinson, the secretary of the union at that time, walked out onto the veranda overhanging the footpath with, I think, Ron Owens, who was the organiser for the union, and raised his clenched fist as we walked past. With respect to the builders' labourers, there wasn't much actual organised activity as there was in, say, the Siemens Union with the Jabara and so on, of that nature, but they certainly very strongly supported the movement.
Okay, next question.
I just want to ask about events that occurred in Vietnam that influenced the moratorium response from the public. I was in Malay in 2000 and saw the memorial to the kids and parents who had been gunned down. What effect did the My Lai massacre have on the movement and the impetus of getting people to consider that the war was illegal?
Well, I think it had a huge impact because those came in 1968, the 10th offensive as well. Both of those changed a lot of thinking, and I think it was about that time that some of the polling started to change tracks, that the anti-war feeling started to get up to 50% and then finally cross over. I think they were quite seminal events.
Before the My Lai massacre, there was an incident involving Australian troops. This was very early in the commitment. It involved waterboarding a young Vietnamese woman, and it resulted in one of the ministers, I can't remember which one of the ministers of the then government, having to try and explain this incident away, which he couldn't really do because there was a photographer there who had photographs of this young woman with water down her body. Now, my experience of Australian soldiers who participated in Vietnam is that they're as broad a representative of the general population as you could expect. I worked with a bloke in my union who went to Vietnam, who intervened and took a Vietnamese prisoner away from Americans because of what they were doing to him. So, you know, good and bad, mixed experiences, but certainly that incident was one of the first I can remember that was pointing a guilty finger towards Australian troops and the way that they were behaving in Vietnam.
Well, we've got time for two more questions.
Would any of the speakers like to speak briefly about the publicity of the Phoenix programme? About the Phoenix programme, which was the US counterinsurgency programme from the late 1960s and the atrocities.
Call us out. Take a seat. Yes.
I just wanted to make an answer to the question before about the involvement of the trade union in the anti-war.
Okay, that's fine.
My first recollection of the first major action that took place was the occupation of the American consulate in 1968, which resulted in 22 people sitting in the consulate and being arrested. That meeting consisted of the waterside workers, the seamen, and students from Adelaide and Willis University. That's the first united action that I can remember. I've forgotten that.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Yes?
I don't know if people are aware that Jim Cairns said that there were 3 villages that were massacred by Australian soldiers. I was in the first delegation at the end of '75 to go across to Vietnam, and we found that this was actually true. And he was denigrating a lot about bringing that up, but it was actually had happened because they were spitting at us and telling we weren't allowed out after night in the night because the people in the area hated the Australians. But as a result, I'm also involved with the Australian Vietnam.
Have you got a question? Sorry.
And I don't know if you know much about the Australian Vietnam Friendship Society.
No, have you got a question for the panel?
Yes, if they know anything about that.
Right. Well, we have badges and we have leaflets here. So, is anyone a member of the Vietnam? Any other questions? Adrian?
I'd like to go back to the question that Greg posed very pointedly at the end of his excellent presentation. In fact, all presentations have been fantastic. The thought and effort and accuracy that's gone into them has been very impressive. And it brings us to the point that the moratorium was an extraordinary historical, political event. To me, one of the great achievements was that it actually co-opted the political support of the Labor Party in the end and contributed to Gough Whitlam, unquestionably
You've got a question,
to Gough Whitlam's election. So my question, Doug, is this. Since 1972, it's all gone quiet on the Western Front. There was a big resurgence in opposition to Iraq. In fact, I think the massive marches all around the world owed something to the moratorium experience. But we're at a point where there is growing international tensions, especially with between the great powers. We still have nuclear weapons rampant. What is it that we can learn from the moratorium that can contribute to addressing some of the massive problems that we have today?
Adrian, thank you for that. But I think we're having a summing up from Stephen Darley, who's going to address himself to those points. Would that be right? Yep. So I'd rather defer to him. Thank you.
One more question. So someone that hasn't asked a question yet wants to? If not, we'll go back. Oh, in a minute. After the, yeah, one more question then. This was down the red.
So, you know, as it was mentioned, some members of the women's liberation movement mixed into the anti-war movement and the trade union movement. Was there much overlap with the emerging Aboriginal land rights movement with the anti-war movement?
There was coincidence of membership. Many people who were active in the anti-war movement were also joining the Aboriginal, or supporting the Aboriginal legal rights movement, for example, and there were some other organisations. There had, of course, been the huge 1967 referendum campaign, and many people, I'd been overseas the year before that, so I wasn't part of that, but I think many people had been actively involved in supporting that. But by the time you get to 1970, they're running in parallel rather than having any overlap with each other. But people were supporting both, and I was supporting the Aboriginal legal rights movement at the time.
Thank you for that. Just before Steve,
Thank you.
to make
Just a quick comment. I wasn't in Adelaide, but researching Wilf's The Women's History, I came across this. So this is what we did about search for their involvement. And I'll just read one thing. In March 1966, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom organised a protest march believed to be the first in South Australia. A group of women carrying handheld banners walked in single file along the footpath in King William Street to the South Australia Hotel where Harold Holt, then Prime Minister, was staying.
Very quick. I'm saying hello to everybody on behalf of Audrey Wattakiri, who was very involved in the movement. And now sadly she is too old and frail to be here today, but she's very proud of that and still talks about it.
thank you. Steve? So let's introduce Steve Darley from IPAN, who's going to just bring the day together. And then there's plenty of photos to look at and things while we're clearing up.
Yes, I'm on the coordinating committee of the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, the current Australian National Peace Coalition. I wasn't actually in Adelaide at the time of the moratorium. I was experiencing the delights of British occupation of my city, Belfast, and the north of Ireland. So, you know, a different kind of experience, but still military. My brief is to connect the Vietnam War and the large-scale protests against it in Australia to the present day. Obviously, the US alliance still prevails, and so do the negative effects of that alliance on Australia and Australians. More on that shortly. One key result from my analysis of the experience of the Vietnam War and the moratorium campaign against it was the end of mass Australian casualties in such colonial wars. The proportion between Vietnam and Afghanistan deaths and casualties is less than a tenth that in the latter war, and much less in Iraq. This bears no relationship, of course, to the deaths and injuries of Vietnamese, Afghanis, and Iraqis. They number in the millions, civilian and military. So it's reasonable to conclude that Australian governments decided that mass casualties as a result of some form of conscription were not politically advisable. More importantly, frankly. The US agreed, mostly because they were more interested in political support than in cannon fodder. And the commitment of a relatively few aircraft, ships and army units was for that reason for that political reason above all. Of course, in another respect, Australia continued to risk mass casualties through the hosting of key US bases at Pangat, Narungga until 1999, and Northwest Cape, which were and are clear nuclear targets. They are remote from most Australian population centres, but that's of little comfort to the residents of Alice Springs and Exeter in Western Australia. That risk remains today and has probably grown. And might well be joined by Robertson Barracks and Tyndall RAAF base, Robertson Barracks, where the American Marine contingent is, some 30 kilometres from Darwin. And Tyndall RAAF base, where there are about to be American nuclear-capable bombers on a regular basis landing and taking off and refueling. By the way, that's costing Australia and Australia's people over $1 billion to upgrade for American war. The other major risk to Australia today is economic, through the increasingly irrational focus on destroying our relationship to our biggest trading partner, China, at the behest of the US. That's not to say that China is pure as driven snow when it comes to either the South China Sea or relations with Australia. It is, however, clear that the main aggression, indeed frenzy, comes from the US, and Australia is dragged along behind. That frenzy is bipartisan. Anyone bearing illusions that the mainstream Democrats are any more peaceable than Trump and the Republicans have missed turning a blind eye, missed or turned a blind eye to Biden's pronouncements in recent months when he attacked Trump for being too soft on China, or only a week ago when he declared the US may have to increase its military budget under a Biden-Harris administration, or a Harris administration, as she herself said by mistake last week, for obvious reasons. The main difference is that Democrats want to focus first on Russia and then move on to China. So pick your target, the biggest economy on earth or the biggest nuclear power after the US. The collective delusion that this will go well is driven not by political parties as such, but by the absolute unwillingness of the US corporate elite to accept the decline of the US that is evident to all the rest of us. This is not a healthy or a well-driven wagon to hitch ourselves to, but we are. Australia's coal, not so bad, but for other reasons. Barley, wine and educational sectors are currently taking the biggest hits from the deteriorating relationship with China, but other sectors will almost certainly follow. Again, it's not necessary to remain silent about Chinese human rights abuses, as long as we admit our own, particularly towards First Nation peoples and refugees, and internationally towards Timor-Leste, and some others, but particularly Timor-Leste. And then we seem able not to only trade with, but sell arms to such shining lights of human decency as Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel. Another important political effect of the moratorium years, as has already been mentioned, and the failed war itself, was to increase the impulse towards a more independent Australia, reflected to some degree in the actions of the Whitlam government. Their relatively mild actions were savagely punished, no doubt sent a clear message to successive Australian governments who haven't been willing to go that far since. We are now faced with the threat of global, conventional and nuclear war as we haven't since the 1980s, when again many Australians turned out to protest. 30,000 on Palm Sunday 1986 was the largest, I think. An effort even bigger than those rallies and the moratorium campaign will be necessary if we are to avoid this fate. So I can only conclude by saying to the moratorium campaign, we follow in your footsteps against all colonial and neo-colonial wars. Thank you. IPAN nationally is about to announce a public inquiry into the costs and consequences of the US alliance to Australia, covering areas from environmental to political, to democratic rights, to foreign policy, and obviously economic. and that we'll be asking for submission from groups and individuals all over Australia for the next year or so, if we have another year. Thank you.
There's plenty to look at, but hang on, we haven't even thanked the speakers yet. So, on behalf of Labour History and IPAN and the joint committee that's been working on this for over a year actually, thank you very much. I think it's been a very lively debate, and thank you for making the time on this beautiful spring afternoon. And to you guys, thanks for coming, giving up the first real spring day, and thank you all for obeying the COVID-19 plan.